We are back on Taking Care of Business with Clay and Marty, and our guest by phone is Dr. William Allen, the former chairman and member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights under President Reagan. Clay?
You know, Bill, I just, when I was listening to you talk about President Reagan, and ironically I call him President Reagan and I call Obama Mr. Obama, but when you're talking about President Reagan, I happened to listen to Fox News the other night, and George H.W. Bush was on, and he was saying the same things you were saying about President Reagan.
Well, I'm not surprised by that. I think everyone, and even people who didn't begin out with any susceptibility, would be affected by him in the end. He just had a tremendous charisma, a word that gets overused, but is very important.
You know, Bill, it's interesting. We're having a show next weekend on Martin Luther King. We've got three friends of ours from the black community here in Bakersfield, and we're going to talk about Martin Luther King. And I was on a plane to Vancouver, and there and back I was listening to a lot of Dr. King's speeches. And I'm listening to his speeches, and I'm listening to Ronald Reagan, and I'm going, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. And I'm thinking, my God, what have we done wrong in the black community, in the minority community, to where, you know, they've gone towards the Democrats when you look at the family value issues and so much of the issues, they're more in line with the conservatives in the Republican Party than they are the Democrats. Where have we gone wrong?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. Ever since really at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, when the transition took place and black voters moved to the Democrat Party, it's been a complete mystery how the Democrats have maintained such a lockhold, stranglehold on those communities throughout this country, because it's been an up and down performance. I'll give you just one example. I could give you many, many, many. Just one. At present in New York, there's a huge battle going on over the state-supported abortions, which it turns out statistics are proving operate overwhelmingly to control minority populations, and so dramatically, with numbers so out of all proportion to any reasonable expectation that some people are speaking of it as genocide. Well, this has been something that's been apparent for the last 40 years and has been spoken about within black communities, and yet no one has been mobilized to act or to withdraw the commitment of loyalty to those politicians who sustain these practices. I don't know how to explain this apart from a single thing, namely that as the welfare state grew and people were trained to come into dependence upon it, it had a profound and perverse effect within black communities, and not black communities alone, but particularly there. And so I think that is what has undermined it. And I noticed even with Martin Luther King, in the course of his career, towards the latter stage, he began to do and say things that even undermined some of his earlier commitments to principles. And he's the one who went to Chicago and began to introduce the victim rhetoric, which took the emphasis away from people doing for themselves and began to echo the expectation of people having government to do for them. So this process, this transition over a long period of time just seems to have operated so perversely as to undermine completely the integrity of self-reliance throughout black communities in this country. And until that is repaired, I don't see much hope for any change in behavior.
Mm-hmm. You know, I want to make a comment on the comment you made about the abortion versus, well, almost genocide.
Yes.
And if anybody questions what I'm about to say, please look it up on the computer, because it is there. You can find it now on the computer. When I did the research on this for a book I had written 20 years ago, we had to go into the archives. It's all on the computer now. But if you look at pre-Planned Parenthood, the mother organization for Planned Parenthood was called Birth Control Review, and one of the stated objectives of the Birth Control Review was to eliminate minorities and eliminate those, I'm trying to remember how they put it, but those of less higher quality individuals through the use of abortion.
Yes.
It has always been one of the stated objectives. And, you know, again, don't believe me. Look it up on the computer, because it's there. You know, as much as they would like to hide it, it is there in black and white for everybody to read. and it's frightening because of the the consequences that that it's had in not only the black community but in any minority community.
Yes, quite so.
Go ahead, Clay. You were going to.
No, I had nothing to say on that. One thing I did say is Planned Parenthood came out just this week and said that only 3% of their funding goes towards abortion, which I found hard to believe.
We know.
Yeah.
We know it's
Right.
an absolute falsehood, but they are practiced at falsehood, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. We've got about 4 minutes left, and Bill, I would love to have you on again. Okay, we knew this was going to be a real quick hour, and I knew it was going to be. We were going to get stuck on something like Egypt, a subject like that, not be able to get off because you're just a joy to talk to, and we would love to have you back some other time if possible.
Well, it's been a joy to chat with you and with Clay, and I would be happy to come back at any time.
Good. Well, I have two questions for you. One you and I talked about the other day. I was doing a little research for the interview, and I ran across a talk you had given at Grambling in 1991. And I think it kind of related somewhat to Black History Month, and it was entitled "Why I'm Still Black."
Oh, yes.
I love that talk, and I'd like to, if you have a minute or two, just to talk about that and where you were going with that talk.
Well, let me remind you of what the context was historically.
Mm-hmm.
It had only been within a few years prior to my giving that talk that the world had been instructed by Jesse Jackson, foremost, and a few others, that they had to begin referring to black folk as African Americans.
Right.
And so I entered into that conversation by refusing to embrace the command of the master and explaining why it was that I found the reference to black to be not only apt and appropriate, but a far more effective way of establishing a clear identity. I did that in a number of ways, but my point, without trying to give you the whole talk in 2 minutes, my point was a very simple point, namely, people who are self-respecting and independent determine the meaning of their names by their own conduct. And so they don't need to go through this constant process of changing names and choosing names for effect. A good person's name will become itself the name for goodness.
Well, I can applaud that.
Of my message.
Mm-hmm.
I can applaud that, Bill.
And I love the way you ended the article. Let's see, I'm looking for the last page here. When people can refer to color because color no longer is an issue, the reason I remain black is because I insist on being all-American. That just sent shivers up my spine when I read that, Bill. That was an excellent way to make that point. So, Bill, we are unfortunately out of time almost, and I know, Clay, you've got a closing remark you want to make on an event you were at this.
A couple of things I want to mention,
okay.
And I want to thank Dr. Allen. I thought it was a tremendous interview, and I really enjoyed listening to you today, Doctor.
And one last comment I've got to make on Dr. Allen. Next time we have him on, I want to talk about his book, Rethinking Uncle Tom, but it's a great book. I highly, highly recommend it. Bill, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted, and I invite anyone to take a look at my website who wants to see what those things are that I've been doing.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, sir.
And Clay, you had a comment you wanted to make?
A couple of things I wanted to mention. This is my Facebook note on the radio. This morning I attended a really interesting meeting at the Doubletree Hotel put on by the Door Institute, and they talked about how they're doing knee replacements and hip replacements, and boy, I got to tell you, it was really fascinating, and they do a tremendous job. They had their doctors there, they had the anesthesiologists there, and they had a lot of their team there, and if anybody needs a knee or a hip replacement, I have to recommend the Door Institute, where I personally went. And the second thing I wanted to mention is today was Bob Price's funeral, and we've lost a great man who represented the city of Bakersfield wonderfully.
And I'd like to thank Dr. Allen again, and we will be here next week in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio, News Talk 1180.